Hello everyone, my name is Gary Wills. I'd like to welcome you to episode 25 of my YouTube channel. This video is about something slightly different, still in the Napoleonic Wars. This time it's a refight of the Battle of Crysler's Farm from the 11th of November 1813. Usually I use black powder as my preferred rule set, but for this video I'm trying out the new set from Jervis Johnson called Valour and Fortitude, which is obviously all the rage. This map shows the enormous extent of the territory that the campaign or the war of 1812 to 14 actually took place in. But the scenario today takes place in a small part of that entire theatre of action on the border between the United States and British North America or Canada. So the bit we're interested in is one of the invasions of Canada that the US launched during this war. Major General James Wilkinson, after some delay, had left Sackett's Harbour and was moving up the St. Lawrence River towards Montreal, which he hoped to capture. In pursuit, the British and Canadian forces were led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison of the 89th Foot, who led a small corps to observation in pursuit up the river. So just beyond Morrisburg, on the banks of the St. Lawrence, the two sides came to blows at a place near Crysler's Farm. So let's look at the battlefield in a bit more detail. The first thing to note is, compared to today, as a lot of you will know, the St. Lawrence was much narrower waterway then than it is now. The map I used for my refight is this one by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bouchette from 1815. I've used it because Bouchette was a lieutenant colonel in the Lower Canada Militia and was also a surveyor of Canada, so I assumed he knew what he was talking about, given it was done so quickly after the battle. An alternative map is this one that's in Lossing's field book of the war, and I chose not to use it, although it is the one that forms the basis of the maps in Donald Graves's excellent Field of Glory about the battle. What it shows, however, better than the previous map, is that the Americans were actually closer to Montreal than the British were, and decided that they needed to get rid of the British before they could continue their advance. And you can see the American flotilla and their gunboats moored to the east here, with British gunboats from Morrison's force to the west. So a quick slide on the scales that I use in my games. I use approximately a 6x4 battlefield, and one figure I use representing 33 men, and this means that the unit sizes are much smaller than those given in Valour and Fortitude. And I've given them there 6 to 8 for standard, 4 to 5 figures for small, and 10 to 12 for large. Ground scale I use is 1mm to 2 paces. So next I want to cover the two armies, starting with the British. This is the Valour and Fortitude unit profiles, which I've used pretty much as is from the initial publication of the rule set. It's obviously the one for the Peninsular War. So this shows the extract of the play sheet that I used for the British and Canadians. There were 4 brigades in terms of Valour and Fortitude, and they were, as historically was the case, split elements of the British units, the 89th Foot and the 49th Foot, plus the Royal Artillery, alongside some Canadian militia, a Fencible regiment, the Voltigeurs for light troops, and even some First Nation infantry. And the 4th Brigade was made up of the 2 riverboats, which I'll show you shortly. The statistics are not labelled in this chart, but basically show the range and their fire factor, their melee factor, and their tenacity. The numbers of figures are shown in the column after the names of the units. And I've taken pretty much the standard special rules as listed in the army list, giving a points value for the British of 112. So there is no American army sheet for Valour and Fortitude at the time I did this, so I had to make one up. And I'm afraid I'm going to upset a lot of Americans by saying that I started with the Spanish army sheet that's in the basic rules. I did this because it's quite clear from Graves's account that the Americans infantry that fought this day were a pretty mixed bunch, and not necessarily as good as they would perhaps later be. So consequently they are inferior in a number of ways. So this is the other part of my play sheet showing the Americans, and it shows Brigadier General John Parker Boyd as the CNC. He had 4 brigades, those of Coles, Leonard Covington and Robert Swartout, which you can see lined out there. The 1st Brigade actually wasn't really a brigade on the day, but Walbash, who was Wilkinson's adjutant general, seemed to take charge of the cavalry and the artillery. So I thought the best way of representing them in this game was to make him effectively a brigade commander. At the bottom you can see the boat guard, which in the real battle arrived quite late in the day and didn't really affect the result. I represent them there, but I haven't actually painted them up yet, so they don't feature in the game at all. Overall, you can see the Valour and Fortitude characteristics. They're weaker than the British equivalent infantry, such that although there are more Americans on the table, the points are, if anything, slightly in favour of the British, if you like that sort of thing. This chart shows my version of the battlefield and the opening deployment, which I've tried to make as close to the historical deployment as possible. And the key thing to note here is the reinforcements, which I'll talk about later on. You also see some pretty pictures of the key players. This photograph shows the table as I created it, and I'm using this to just explain the terrain effects. The first thing is that the woods area to the furthest away from the waterway all counted as broken terrain, and therefore all movement was at half speed through it. The fences were half removed across, as were the streams, and it's obviously consistent with the style of Valour and Fortitude to keep these things as simple as possible. The other feedback from reading the the histories of the battle and some discussions I've had on Twitter was that the fields were quite wet and difficult to cross. So the brown ploughed areas, which I've shown, you see here, are all areas that halve the speed of movement through them. So, a bit of a word on reinforcements. There aren't any British reinforcements. The US artillery took some time to limber up the guns using dragoon horses and get them moving. So they didn't arrive in time for the start. And for my games, I tend to use 4 moves to an hour. So with the battle starting at 1:30, the first US artillery model arrives on move 8. The other 2 arrive on move 10, which is a bit of a guess based on what is written in Graves' history. On about move 11 would be the time that Upham would arrive. As I've said, I am not representing him. Turn 14 was sunset. Turn 16 was dusk, when the battle had to finish. I made the victory conditions very simple. It's to basically break either army. So it was for both armies had 4 brigades. So I made it that the battle would finish if 2 of the enemy brigades were broken before the end of turn 16. Victory obviously going to the other side. So a word about the rules themselves. I used them as much as I could as written, with these exceptions. Because I was fighting with 15mm figures, I used centimetres instead of inches throughout. I didn't allow either side to use attack columns, which is not allowed for the British anyway, but I applied that to the Americans. I found the fate cards to be frankly a nuisance. 16 turns would have given 32 fate cards. In my practice games it was very hard to keep track of them all. So in this game I used a full deck of 52 playing cards and only turned over 1 card per turn, which gave a more reasonable average result of 8 fate cards in the game, 4 per side. So let's see that in action. This is turn 1. The fate card turned out to be the 10 of diamonds, and the British had hearts and the US had spades, so that meant there was no fate card. So I'm using turn 1 to give you a tour of the battlefield as much as anything else, so you can see the troops as they turned up on the table. And to start off with, you can see here Wallback and the only unit of his brigade on the table, the Light Dragoons. And here's Covington's brigade of 3 units advancing across the first line of fences into the ploughed ground. And you can see the regiments there, the 9th, 16th and 25th Infantry Regiments. The green token that's by the 25th Infantry Regiment marks this regiment as being unpredictable, as I described earlier. In the centre you can see Colonel Isaac Coles advanced again across the first line of fences, and here you can see perhaps how quickly the units can move under Valour and Fortitude. Swartwood's brigade was slowed down by the woods that they were moving through. And in the latter brigade, you can see the 21st Infantry Regiment marked by the yellow symbol token, describing it as a militia regiment. And here's Captain Mulcaster with his 2 gunboats, which under Valour and Fortitude rules I move as other, i.e. 12 centimetres. So ground scale is always a problem when representing things like boats and buildings on 15mm battlefields, and obviously my models only show a passing resemblance to the real thing, which is shown in the print on the right. However, I think it's better to do this, which uses a Peter Pig rowing boat modified with a gun platform on it, rather than trying to put a scale model on and fill in an unrealistically large portion of the battlefield. Here we see Morrison and his brigade, including the artillery, which is just two 6-pounder guns, moving forward into the fields to try and confront the Americans. So I felt I had to represent the Dundas militia, which don't represent very much in black powder, let alone Valour and Fortitude. So, but they're there, they're on the table, but they're really just part of the scenery. So Morrison's 2nd Brigade, led by Thomas Pearson of the 23rd Foot, comprises 3 companies of the 89th Foot, the flank companies of the 49th Foot, and the Canadian Fencibles, 2 companies thereof, and 1 Royal Artillery 6-pounder gun. Bit difficult this. I basically used 2 guns for an artillery unit throughout the game, and I was left with the choice of either not representing this one or giving them the British a slight advantage. So they got a model gun, even though it only represents 1 actual gun. And finally, lurking in the woods, you can see Major Herriot's light troops in his brigade. It's not really a brigade because it only included 3 companies of the Canadian Voltigeurs and some First Nation troops. But with the rules, it was easier to represent them as a separate brigade rather than part of Pearson's brigade, because they were quite a long way from them. And Valour and Fortitude doesn't have the same flexibility that black powder does for this. So here's a view of the table at the end of turn 1. Right, so now moving on to game turn 2 and starting with the fate card. And you can see here the Jack of Clubs has been turned over, so that means no fate card for this turn. There's no firing, so the turn starts with Covington leading his brigade across the difficult terrain towards Pearson's men. Likewise, Cole's 2 battalions, having crossed the 2nd fence line, are in the muddy ploughed field. Meanwhile, Swatoud's brigade makes heavy going of advancing through the woods at half speed. So moving on to the British turn 2 and starting with Pearson's brigade. In the fire phase, the British artillery opened up on Covington's brigade, causing 1 casualty. And in the action phase, Mulcaster brought his gunboats up to support the British artillery and the rest of Pearson's brigade. In the centre, Morrison brought his brigade forward relentlessly through the mud and ploughed fields, while on the left flank, Herriot's light troops awaited the oncoming Americans in the woods. So here's a view of the battlefield at the end of game turn 2. So moving on to turn 3 and the fate card. This time the card turned over was the Ace of Hearts, a British card, and although the Duke of Wellington was several thousand miles away, nonetheless it was his card. This gives Morrison, the Commander-in-Chief of the British, the ability to add 1 to the Valour and Fortitude tests close by him. So the Americans in turn 3 continued their relentless advance, and starting with Walbach, who brought Woodford's light dragoons forward in an attempt to support Covington's attack. Covington continued to move forward, although his units are still slowed by the broken terrain. In the centre, Isaac Cole's 2 battalions are slogging their way through the heavy mud and have reached yet another fence line. And moving to the right flank in the woods, Swartwood's brigade failed their activation test and consequently couldn't move at all during this move. So moving on to the fire phase of British turn 3, Mulcaster's gunboats have joined the Royal Artillery in taking Covington's infantry under fire, and another 2 casualties were scored. On the other hand, during the action phase, Pearson failed his activation and was unable to move. In the centre, Morrison moved remorselessly on, trying to reach a position from which he could support Pearson's advanced troops. On the British left, Heriot's troops twiddled their thumbs, surprised that nobody was visible to their front. So that was the end of turn 3, and here you can see a shot of the whole table. So turn 4 started with the fate card again, and the King of Clubs came up, so again no fate card was distributed on this turn. And on turn 4, the Americans under Covington continued their advance on the British position despite the artillery fire. And in their support, Woodrove's light dragoons arrived. In the centre, Isaac Coles failed his activation roll and was unable to advance further. This gave Swartwood the chance to draw level with Coles in his continuing advance through the woods. So in the fire phase for British turn 4, the combined artillery on land and on the river failed to cause any more casualties on Covington. In the centre, Morrison has taken advantage of the delay of Isaac Coles and his battalions to bring his men even closer to the support of Pearson's. And on the left wing, Heriot in the woods is quite happy to sit and wait events. So here you can see a picture of the table at the end of turn 4. So turn 5 started with the fate card again, and this time the 10 of spades was turned up for the US. Unfortunately, because we weren't using objectives as part of the game's victory conditions, this was not really relevant to this scenario. So, American turn 5, and the key thing here is Covington was a bit worried about the 25th Infantry Regiment, so he didn't order them to fire. Instead, he chose to rally one of the 3 casualties. And although the 16th Infantry Regiment managed to advance towards the British, the 9th failed their messenger test. Meanwhile, Woodford's light dragoons felt that they were in a better position if they stood behind the 25th Infantry Regiment rather than to their flank, where they were in full view of the British artillery. And in the centre, Isaac Coles got his 2 battalions across the fence line, advancing towards the oncoming British, but chose to deploy his men into line quite wisely. Meanwhile, on the right, the American infantry slogged gamefully on towards their British light opponents. So moving on to the fire phase of the British turn 5, the artillery opened up again on Covington's men, and despite the earlier rally, caused 2 casualties, which resulted in the battalion being shaken. And this in turn generated the first setback of the game on Covington, which is helpfully pointed out by this semi-transparent token by his figure. And meanwhile, Pearson's detachment of the 89th opened up on their American opponents, causing 1 casualty. Meanwhile, in the centre, the remorseless advance of Morrison's men approached the central fence line, with the artillery unlimbering, ready for action. Meanwhile, Heriot continued his waiting game. So that was the end of turn 5, and here you can see the usual picture of the battlefield at this point. So for turn 6, the fate card turned out to be the 8 of spades, which gave the US a free pass on any Valour or Fortitude test that they fail. So here we see the fire phase for American turn 6, and Covington's men open up on both of Pearson's infantry units, causing casualties. Meanwhile, also in Covington's brigade, the 9th close in on the British artillery. And in the centre, Cole's men advance across the field to attack the outnumbered British defenders of the fence line. On the right flank, the Swato's infantry are formed into line and advance closer to Heriot's men. So the fire phase of British turn 6, Pearson's entire brigade opened up on the oncoming Americans, and on their right flank, the 16th Infantry Regiment was shaken by the fire of the British. Meanwhile, the concentrated artillery fire and musket fire caused 3 more casualties on the already shaken 25th Infantry Regiment. So this resulted in 3 Valour tests for the 25th, all of which were failed, so the unit was broken and removed from play. And this photograph shows a hole where the 25th Infantry Regiment once stood. This was bad news for Covington, because now he had not 1 setback but 3 setbacks, and this resulted in the brigade becoming wavering. In the centre, Morrison's men opened up on the oncoming Americans, causing casualties. Meanwhile, the greatcoat-clad 49th Foot reached the fence line. In the woods, Heriot, being light infantry, was able to use his fire and move ability to inflict a casualty on the 21st Infantry Regiment before retiring back through the woods. So that was the end of turn 6, and here's the usual photograph of the table as the 2 armies get to grips. So the fate card for turn 7 turned out to be the Ace of Clubs, which was no help to either side. In the fire phase, Covington's remaining men opened up on the British infantry to their front, causing a casualty. In the action phase, Covington's 9th Infantry continued to march forward towards the artillery to their front. However, Colonel Walbach was unlucky and failed his activation test, which would have some unfortunate consequences. So in the centre, in the fire phase, Isaac Cole's men opened up on the 89th and caused a casualty. In the woods, meanwhile, Swato's brigade laboured their way forward through the broken ground in pursuit of the ephemeral Canadian light infantry. In the British firing phase of turn 7, Pearson's men, plus their supporting artillery, opened up on the now exposed light dragoons, causing 3 casualties in all. The continued fire on the 16th Infantry Regiment caused a Valour test, but in fact there were 2 Valour tests, and as you can see, the Americans were successful in passing those. In the centre, the other British artillery battery opened up on the 9th Infantry Regiment, causing it to become shaken. The 3rd Brigade becoming shaken caused yet another setback on Covington, who therefore was required to take a fortitude test. And although the dice roll was a failure, 2, the good news was they were able to use their fate card, the 8 for spades, to give an automatic pass. Also in the firing phase on British turn 7, the 89th were able to cause more casualties on one of Isaac Cole's brigades, shaking it. Meanwhile, Heriot was quite happy with his sit and wait strategy on the left flank in the woods. So that's the end of turn 7, and here you can see the battlefield at this crucial point. So we're now in turn 8, and the fate card this time was another club, the 2 of clubs, so that was no good to either side. Although you can see in the bottom of this photograph later on in the turn, the first of the American artillery arrived. So we're now in the firing phase of American turn 8, and here you can see the Covington's 16th Infantry Regiment has opened up on their British opponents, causing another casualty. And meanwhile, later in the turn, the 9th have charged in to attack the British artillery. And this resulted in the first melee of the game. In the melee, the American infantry managed to create enough casualties to shake the defending artillery. However, the 9th Infantry had suffered 2 casualties themselves and had to take a Valour test because they were already shaken. And they passed the Valour test on the basis of having won the melee alone. Meanwhile, Isaac Coles had led his 2 battalions in an assault on his British opponents at the fence line. And the assault caused enough casualties to shake the 89th Foot. However, it also caused sufficient casualties on the 12th Infantry Regiment to require a Valour test, which the unit unfortunately failed. So this caused 2 setbacks for Isaac Coles, which meant that his brigade was now wavering. So in the action phase of turn 8, Walbash was unable to withdraw the light dragoons and rally one of their casualties. Meanwhile, the infantry of Swato's brigade managed to close in within range of the Canadian light infantry. So in the firing phase of British turn 8, Pearson's infantry opens up on the 16th US infantry to their front, causing 2 more casualties. So this caused another 2 Valour tests for Covington's infantry, of which both were failed, resulting in the removal of the 16th Infantry Regiment. And to make matters worse, Covington then had to take a fortitude test, which he failed with a miserable 1, which meant that him and his remaining battalion the 9th Infantry Regiment were removed from the game. So in the action phase of British turn 8, Pearson failed his activation, so was unable to conduct any further movement. So moving on to Morrison in the British centre, he started by rallying one of the casualties from the artillery battery. However, the continuing melee at the fence line with the 89th didn't go so well. They lost 3 casualties and they were already shaken. So that meant 3 Valour tests, and they scored 3 on each of those die rolls, which would have meant a fail, but the Iron Duke card, Ace of Hearts, was played, which gave them a +1 on each of those results, meant that they passed. So that meant that the turn ended with Morrison still with only 1 setback to his name. So Heriot decided to continue his retirement through the wood, although this would have some consequences. Thus ended game turn 8, and you can see a view of the table here. So the fate card for turn 9 was another American one, Surprise Attack, the 9 of spades. Play this card in your fate phase and enable 1 friendly unit to carry out 1 move. So the Americans played it straight away, enabling the 21st Infantry Regiment to advance to the defence line on the flank of the 89th Foot. So you can see here in game turn 9, the 21st have managed to cross the fence, bearing down on the 89th Foot. In the continuing melee, the 89th suffered another casualty, and they had a Valour test, but I seem to allow them, based on this photograph, to pass with only a 3, which is a mistake for a melee. On the other side of the fence, the 13th Infantry Regiment were shaken, which created an for Coles, and this meant he had to take a Fortitude test, but a good roll of 5 meant he passed. Also during the turn, Walbash was belatedly bringing some of the artillery forward in support. So in the British turn 9, Morrison withdrew the 89th from the melee to give this rather square-looking arrangement. And meanwhile, Heriot withdrew the Canadians even further away from their opponents. So that was the end of game turn 9. The fate card for turn 10 was a diamond, so it was no use to either side. So in the fire phase of American turn 10, the combined forces on the American right wing opened up and caused more casualties on the 89th, and they were able to pass their Valour test. Meanwhile, Walbash brought forward the American artillery. So moving on to the fire phase of British turn 10, the British infantry opened fire on the 13th Infantry Regiment, causing another 3 casualties. And this caused a Valour test, or 3 Valour tests, of which the 13th were only able to pass 2. So consequently, the 13th, Isaac Coles's last unit, was removed from the game. So, given that the victory conditions were to break 2 enemy brigades before the end of turn 16, the demise of Isaac Cole's brigade in a blaze of fire ended the game rather abruptly, with both his brigade and Covington's brigades broken. So consequently, we have to declare a British-Canadian win. So the game ends immediately at that point, so this is the final view of the table. So let's have a few conclusions, having played a couple of test games of Valour and Fortitude. Well, you can definitely say it's a very interesting set of rules. It's very stripped down, and that has some consequences. It's tempting, because Jervis Johnson wrote the rules, to describe them as Black Powder 3rd edition, but I don't think they are, for a number of reasons. They're quite different. Obviously, the fate cards are a big difference from Black Powder, but in my view, particularly for a game of the size I was playing, there were just too many fate cards, and I needed to reduce them to make the game playable in the way I've just shown you. Some may not like what I did, but nonetheless, I think there was a good argument for it. I think if you play with the full amount of fate cards, it's really important that you have the fate card set up such that the effects are printed on them in some way, shape or form, either putting the playing cards in card holders and having slips of paper in them, or generating whole new cards, which is a bit of an effort but can be done. Even with the reduced number of cards I used, I'd rather have had them written on the card. Another big difference from Black Powder is that there is only token friction in the game. You've got a 1 in 6 chance of your brigades not activating at any one point in time. So compared to Black Powder, that means the generals in this game have an effective staff rating of 9, which is quite high, and means that by and large you're going to be moving most of your stuff most of the time, which for those people who don't like Black Powder because it has a high element of friction may be a real selling point for Valour and Fortitude. However, it's not consistent with my reading of military history, which we find the battles are probably the most chaotic thing that humans undertake. So you need friction, I think, to get a good feel for how these things worked. Firepower in the game is very effective, and this is even so given the fact that the ranges are relatively short compared to, say, Black Powder. The artillery ranges are very short. And the other thing about the firepower is it's all or nothing. So if I was running this as I will be, as a Black Powder scenario, the gunboats would not have been as effective as the land-based artillery. But there's no way to mimic that in Valour and Fortitude. So probably if I was playing it again in Valour and Fortitude, I'd remove one of the gunboats. The key dynamic in the game is between hits from shooting and melee against Valour test results. So whether the hits have any effect depends on the Valour test, rather than in games like Black Powder where it's a straight off contrast between the hits and the saving throws, which is different. It's equivalent. It's just a different way of looking at it. At the end of the day, it gave a historical result. I don't know if I played the Americans as well as I might have done. All in all, it might have been better to wait until some of the artillery arrived, because there were still 6 turns to go before bringing the infantry on so far. Well, that's the end of my video. I hope you've enjoyed it. A few close-up shots of the figures, which are all miniature figurines, and this goes back to the start of this project. So over 30 years ago, I turned up to one of the partisans in Newark. It was so long ago that it was at the sports centre before they went to Kelham Hall, and I picked up a packet of American minifigs on the bring and buy stand, and they've been waiting around for 30 years for me to get around to paint them, and it was my desire to see them painted that resulted in this scenario. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to any feedback. Thank you.